Hello and welcome back to Climbing on Mount Sophia. I'm here today with David Potts. David is a good friend of mine. We actually went to high school together. It's kind of high school. It was more like homeschool with a tutor. It was a very small school. I think there was maybe a max of 20 at any given time. And you were 3 years ahead of me. Is that right?
Something like that. Yeah, I graduated 2009.
Okay. Yeah. So David was someone who, at that point in my life, I was a young teenager and sort of had all kinds of things going on as you do. And I always remember, and I think maybe I actually told you this around the time I graduated, or maybe even later, that um, for multiple reasons, I always felt like I saw Jesus through you. Like the heart of Jesus just kind of came through you. You had this just incredible, and you still do have an incredible sense about you of caring for people, and that seems to play out in your life too. So I've learned a lot from you, although we've not been all that close since high school. Really, I don't think I'd talked to you for maybe eight or 9 years before we just made contact recently. But so thank you for coming. I'm excited to see you and chat with you again.
Yeah, thank God. Thanks for having me on.
So um you've been mostly involved in church and youth ministries for most of your adult life, right?
Yeah. Actually, I kind of started youth ministry in high school. Just before we met, kind of went hand in hand with my conversion. When I became a Christian, I just immediately I don't know, I've just always loved kids, and I just somehow feel like I can connect with kids, and especially teenagers, more than adults sometimes, because they just kind of, they let down their walls a little bit more. They're a little bit more raw and childish and goofy, kind of like me. So I just kind of tend to connect with them, and it just kind of went hand in hand with, like, I don't know, if there was anything kids needed or whatever, I tend to try to be there for them, and that's about it. But
Yeah. So tell me if a little bit, if you're willing to, about how you came to Christianity, because you didn't grow up Christian, is that right?
yes and no. I have a pretty, like, wide range of experiences. So to go a little bit further back, my parents got married Catholic,
Hmm.
and I went to a Catholic church until I was 10. And then my mom got into more like Tao Buddhism, I think is what she would kind of identify. And then my dad began going to kind of like a charismatic, what do you call that, Pentecostal
Mm-hmm.
Protestant. And so I was involved in that, kind of in hand with my conversion, around like 14, 16 till 25. And then, yeah, later on, I became an Orthodox Christian.
So what was it that so you saw this kind of move to the east with your mother,
Yeah.
and then so you start in Catholicism, which is maybe somewhere in the middle, actually, in a sense, and your mother moves east, and your father moves west in a way to
Yeah.
the because I've never been Pentecostal, but my understanding from people who I know who are Pentecostal is it's quite rigorous in terms of its kind of fundamental beliefs, and then it is very sort of emotional in its expression.
Yeah. Yeah. I think that's mostly accurate. Kind of very conservative, with uh, morals and things like that, ideally. But then, yeah, a little bit more based on the experiential of kind of the supernatural and miracles and things like that.
What do you think drew you in that direction rather than the eastern direction?
Well, it really just kind of, it was kind of where my dad was going at the time. My timeline is not always perfectly in a box, as all of our lives are. But I, I kind of began going to church before I would necessarily even say that I became a Christian,
Hmm.
or like had a conversion of the heart. So it was kind of like Christian and outward, you know, behavior and morals and things. But really, I found that to me, Christianity was true when, I use that word conversion. It was more of a heart phenomenon than necessarily even a belief shift. Because,
Mm.
like I said, I grew up in a mostly Christian believing home, but it didn't really become mine until this kind of conversion experience.
And what was that like?
So I had to go back a little ways again. I grew up in a super awesome family. Both my parents to this day, I consider to be, some of the most loving people I've ever met. Really adventurous, just always gave me everything I ever needed or wanted, super like sportsy, recreational. I've got lots of good stories about just how unique my parents were with some of our adventurousness.
I remember your parents as being pretty fun. I didn't know your mom that well, but your dad he was a real joy to be around.
Yeah, I hate to say this, but my mom was a tomboy, and I'd say she's probably more athletic than my dad. And my dad was like the star fullback in football in high school, and my mom won state tennis championship when she was in high school. So super athletic family.
Nice.
Um, but what made them a little bit more unique, I guess, in Colorado, is the typical like outdoorsy family going camping, lots of weekends, hikes, mountain biking, all this kind of stuff. And one of my favorite stories is that kind of describes the uniqueness of my family is that, so when I was a kid, I didn't like hiking, and I would complain a ton. And so my parents were super into hiking. And when I was about like 6 or 8 years old, they wanted to go hiking with me and camping and stuff. But I just complained so much, and I just like cry and, stuff to get along with. So what my dad ended up doing is that he rented a llama, and the llama would carry some of our stuff, and then he would just plop me on the llama. This is your version of hiking. And so I got a free ride out of it. I didn't have to walk at all. My brother was super jealous because he was too like heavy to be allowed on the llama. And later in life, I found out that the llama got sold to the glue factory because they make glue out of the horse hooves.
Oh dear.
From
Oh
what I've
dear.
heard. And just the last little fun tidbit about it is that, like, we rented this llama for many weekends, and at one point my dad, in his uniqueness, rented the llama for our birthday party, and he would give all the neighborhood kids a ride around the backyard on the llama. So that was like a good description of my like kind of unique upbringing. Is my dad was very creative. We were always traveling, doing sports. So it was travel hockey. We traveled across the nation from when I was like 6 or 8 years old in an RV, just doing like competitive BMX racing. And so
Oh yeah.
anyway, I just kind of go that far back because in a way, you kind of have to understand how like unique and like loving my family was to kind of fully experience the tragedy to me of like divorce and like some of the hard parts of my life too. So like that's like kind of a potential transition to kind of my conversion experience. But
Mm.
my family background was awesome, and
Mm. Mm.
kind of set me up for who I am today.
Yeah. So I actually, that's interesting because I thought I knew you somewhat well in high school, but you think in high school it's sort of an interesting level. You don't tend to know people that well, actually. But so when you kind of foreshadowed that your parents ended up getting divorced, and did that play a role in your conversion experience, and what happened there, if you're willing to share it?
Of course, yeah. Let's see. So the divorce was kind of a slow process. When I was about 14, I just started noticing more kind of arguments in the home, and it would be mostly between my mom and my dad, but it would occasionally kind of involve my brother, and they mostly tried to kind of shelter us from the arguments. They'd go close the bedroom door and kind of hash it out. And at first it was kind of this private kind of concealing of some of their marital conflict. And then over time, um, they kind of sat us down and basically told us that they were getting legally separated, which they did it in kind of a unique way, which I don't have to go deep into, but basically my dad would be in the home for 2 weeks, and then my mom would be in the home for 2 weeks. And so basically it was in the hopes to keep the home settled, and so that we would have the most stability, and that they were the ones that were kind of taking the dysregulation kind of so even in their divorce, they handled it in loving ways. I mean, even their legal fees, when they actually settled the divorce, all the money that would have gone into like my dad paying out like child support would have gone to, well, it ended up going to my brother and I as our like college fund. We got like 60 to 80 grand and like
Wow, that's awesome.
funding. So it was awesome. But anyway, so like, yeah, just kind of, that was the beginnings. And then over the process of like 2 years, I might be getting my timelines mixed up somewhat, but by the when I was 14, like I said, I was church going, and my dad and my pastor invited me to kind of go deeper and kind of like studying about Jesus. And so I was a church goer. I was very interested. I wanted my dad to kind of share with me his faith, and learn about him, learn about the faith in the process. But I had, again, not yet experienced this conversion of the heart. And so in order to go deeper in kind of studying the life of Jesus, I decided to take a year off of public school. I went to a Weber Junior High in Fort Collins, and the idea was basically I was going to study the life of Jesus. I was going to do like guitar for music class. I was going to do like snowboarding for my PE class, and like cool, fun things like that, creative things my dad had kind of put together for my like unique education. And I was really excited about it. And unfortunately, it was a huge letdown because I kind of told all my friends, I'm sorry, I'm going to another school. I'm going to be homeschooled, and my dad's going to do this thing with me. And he ended up getting a job that took him away from the home. And so, with all intents and purposes, I was like left alone at home all day, like with a stack. And so it was the exact opposite of what I was hoping for.
Wow.
And so as a 14-year-old, you have trouble, in homeschool, just studying, with parental kind of like guidance anyway. If anyone has been homeschooled, it's kind of hard to be self-paced in that way. So then just imagine being at home alone for an entire year with a stack of books. Your parents are basically out of the picture. And I just slipped into a deeper and deeper kind of depression. And so forgive me if I cry and get emotional, but it was an extremely difficult year. And what I tried to fill it with was that I began seeing another girl who was also homeschooled, and kind of put all my emotional weight into kind of being with her. This is a crazy story, but I actually at one point stole my mom's engagement ring because she had taken it off at that point, and gave it to this girl and basically proposed to her as a 14-year-old and asked her to run away with me to California. So looking back at it, it's just like ridiculously like, out of bounds. And like, I was like so depressed. I was just like, well, screw it. My family doesn't love me.
But you'd been so unhomed by this point, because like what you described initially in your childhood is such a rich sense of home.
Yeah.
And then sort of this devolvement into sort of just there's something much worse about being in the same place where home used to be and experiencing a loss of home.
Yeah.
As compared to, in fact, being somewhere else even.
Right. Absolutely.
Wow.
Yeah.
Yeah, I
So
guess
I
it's
can,
only appropriate that you would sort of, find whatever avenue you could to jump onto.
yeah, exactly. So I can kind of try to make a long story short, but basically, at one point, when this girl said no to my proposal, thank God, I didn't run away to California with her and marry as a 14-year-old. Um, um, she said no, and then that was like my last like hope of like emotional connection.
Mm,
And so I began to like have suicidal thoughts where I was like, well, um, like if no one loves me, I'm gonna like try to take my life. And um, so like I consider different forms. I don't know if I need to go into that exactly, but like, whether it was pills or, whatever form of like uh, self-harm I could think of. Thankfully, I never like had any attempts, but there were a few nights where my thoughts got really bad, and I basically like brought myself to the hospital, checked myself in, and kind of had like a psychological like diagnosis,
hmm
and kind of they kept me for 24 hours to make sure I didn't hurt myself. And so this was just like the darkest moment of my life, was just feeling that utter abandon,
mm,
by my family. And as a church going Christian, I just also felt like extremely like rejected by God.
mm,
um, that was also very profound because I believed enough to take this leap of faith, to be homeschooled. And I was
mm,
really, really angry with God. And I became really angry with my family. And I
mm,
told my dad, I hate you. And I ran away on a couple of occasions. Didn't
mm.
go far, but for a couple of days I was missing, and would hide at my friend's house. Or I think there was one night that I like purposely kind of like slept in a ditch, to tell my parents like, like screw you, if you keep doing, if you're not around, I'm basically gonna make you feel it. Like I'm gonna
Right,
make you
right.
feel like the consequences of you
Yeah,
abandoning me.
yeah,
So anyway, this is like the depth of my kind of
yeah,
despair.
yeah,
Um,
yeah. Really?
yeah.
No kidding. Man, wow, I didn't know. Wow, I can't believe I didn't know this, but man, thank you for sharing this, because that's a lot to, wow. That's a lot to go through. So you're in this place, you're sort of in the depths of the abyss. And then what happened?
So some people will describe conversion as like, this moment in time, where you accepted Jesus into your heart, or you like began calling yourself a Christian, or you started going to church, or you got baptized and became a member of the church or whatever. I had already had a lot of those experiences. So the reason I call my conversion, I call it was more of like a gradual process for me, because again, it was on a heart level where I began to really experience God and Christianity as true. And I can say that through a number of kind of, what would you say, miraculous like kind of circumstances for that happened over, yeah, a gradual period of like a year. For example, in this depth of despair, I had a dream,
Mm,
where I in the dream I was whatever age I was, 14, 16, I forget. And I saw Jesus, and he held me in his arms, basically like picked me up and held me in his arms like a little child. But it
mm,
was kind of like, how dreams are, they're kind of like a little odd and don't
mm.
fit the exact like realism of real, actual life,
Sure.
where basically I was like a 14-year-old kid, but I was being held in Christ's arms like a child. And that was one of the most pivotal kind of miraculous mystical
Mm,
experiences that I had. And it came from nowhere. Like at that point, I had rejected God. I had
mm,
basically said, I'm not a Christian anymore. When I got to this like depth of despair, I was like, I don't believe in God. I don't believe in love. I don't believe
mhm,
in goodness. Like the closest people to me have hurt me, deeply, and I feel abandoned and afraid. And so I had this dream, and that was kind of one of the first moments that kicked off kind of my conversion of the heart experience. Of, I'd say, kind of miraculous things that happened that kind of just confirmed it for me. One more, sorry if I get too tangential, but one other quick experience that happened was basically when I was at home alone. There was one moment I remember in particular where I was in the backyard and I was like just so empty and stripped of like emotion that I basically like cried out to God and I said, God, if you're real, show yourself to me or I'm going to take my life. And that was like the last straw for me. And I remember feeling this like internal voice. It wasn't my thoughts and it wasn't, I don't know how to describe it. It wasn't an audible voice as you hear like in Christian tradition sometimes, but it was this like voice in my heart that said, I love you, my son. And that was basically it. And that little bit of like love from the heart is what I'd say was like really began to take traction of like conversion, where it was like I had seen Christ in a dream. He, displayed love for me. I had felt this internal voice. Again, it's like I describe it as like outside of myself. It wasn't a thought. It was like I was not thinking about much. It was just, I love you, my son, and I began to believe that. And one of the like, scripture verses that I cling to is like this one that says, "Though father and mother forsake me, I forget how it goes, but you are my shelter. You will not forsake me." I think it's how it goes. Though my father and mother forsake me, you will not forsake me. And so then I began to believe that, and like, okay, I don't have a perfect father and mother, even though I, in all intents and purposes, believe that at the beginning. Then God revealed himself to me in this tangible, miraculous way where I felt like, no, like I experientially now like believe that this is true, not from the head, but from
the heart. Wow. That's really, thank you for sharing that. That's really powerful. There's such a powerful difference between the sort of conversion that you talked about before, where there's kind of the momentary, I accept Jesus into my heart. There's some sort of reasoning process that goes on that makes me assent to some belief system or whatever. And I'm not trying to vilify that, but that's a different thing than journeying down into the depths of the abyss of despair, whatever circumstance takes you there, because we all have circumstance that takes us there, or at least gives us the option to, if we're true to it, if we're faithful to our own life. And a conversion that is a true metanoia, a true turning about. And I love that aspect of your story and how you even described it, that it became a love that grew from inside of you, rather than a thing that was outside of you that you came toward already. It was an upwelling, not of yourself, but an upwelling nevertheless from within you.
Yeah, absolutely.
Man, what a great story.
Yeah.
Thank you for sharing that. That's an amazing story.
Yeah. Thank God. I'm so grateful to have had that experience. Would it be okay if I kind of comment on like other
of course,
experiences of conversion out there? Like you said, not to vilify, but to say that, okay, for Christians, is there's often this like term, like I said, accepting Jesus into your heart, which there's the heart at play, or there's a beginning to go to church, or beginning to live a moral life, or the rational, in the mind, beginning to believe and search out whether this is true. And I I'd say I had the heart conversion first,
Mm,
and rational later, which isn't always the timeline for everyone. But I would say that the rational and the church going, especially, is kind of like it's a step there. But to be honest, I don't know that everyone has a conversion of the heart
mm,
necessarily. I don't know. Maybe they do. Everyone has a different experience, but I've noticed a difference in individuals who have had this type of like, yeah, a conversion of the heart to those who have like a mental rational like assent to facts,
yeah,
because it
yeah.
changes, it really changes the impact and importance of what you believe. Because
Hmm.
like for me, I believe like Christianity to be like true just to the corest, most core part of my being, and I don't know how to describe that to everyone who hasn't had that type of experience, whether in Christianity. I know that others out there may have had experiences in maybe other faiths or religions, or there's lots of secular thought out there about how these types of like experiences are like a projection of the mind, or whatever it is. There's lots of different thought about mystical experience and things like that. But for me, it affected completely 180, what the direction of my life was headed.
Yeah,
Like really, I was going to kill myself,
yeah,
and it was going to be the end. And then just this miraculous like change of events,
yeah.
I can't deny.
Well, and I think there's, we're very confused in the modern world in the sense that we think that what's important is the outcome and what can be demonstrated as the outcome. And there's a really significant difference, although it may look the same, in the actions of a person who has had a conversion of the heart, as you talk about, versus a person who goes through the motions because they sort of need something, and this seems like a decent thing, or their family members are into it, or whatever. That you may in fact even do the exact same things and accomplish the same things in a sort of demonstrable kind of way, but they will in fact be different because they come from different places.
Mhm.
And I think that's like that's very much, I think, what I'm it's really cool actually the way you tell that story, because it's very much what I'm kind of like trying to point at when I talked about how, in a sense, I felt like I saw Jesus through you, because there was something different about the way you acted towards me and towards everyone else at school. And I know that you're not going to take that as sort of like an ego trip thing, which is why I'm saying it to you, because um, and it strikes me very much that, and I my journey shifted dramatically at the point that that sort of thing happened for me. It was a very different context, but that sort of thing where it was the way I describe it is, I no longer wanted to do what was right because of any other reason except that it was what was actually good, and that I wanted to actually be in accordance with what was good, um, to the very core of my being.
Mhm.
And and I don't know, in a way, like you're the light, from you played a role in that. And so since then, and I'll just relate a quick story, which you probably remember, but we had this there was this little Bible study group that grew out of the school, because then you ended up coming to the school where we are, and maybe you might want to talk about that. I don't know if you want to, but um we ended up having this small Bible study thing. And I remember the first one I went to, my parents were very protective of me, and so it was quite a stretch for them to let me go. And I was supposed to be home by 9 p.m. And I went to this couple's apartment and I hadn't seen you you'd been at IHOP, the International House of Prayer, I think, for a year. And you came with your friend. And I remember he was barefoot and had a guitar on his back. And we had this Bible study, and I stayed until like 2 a.m. and we were speaking in tongues, and there was all that. And I had never experienced anything like this. And it was amazing. Like it was one of the really fundamental turning points of my life, because for me, that was when the possibility of Christianity being more than a set of rules that was extraneous to follow became real. And so, like, that sense of the power of the miraculous, like, I think we had a real connection with that.
Absolutely. Yeah, and it's another example of, like, for me, what, the miracles help confirm the truth, that, like, I'm trying to remember the scripture verse. It goes something like, these signs will accompany those who believe.
Mm,
Uh, and so there is a truth, in Christianity to be found, and these miraculous experiences come, at different moments for different people, but the miracles themselves sort of like confirm it to be true because it's through experience. You can believe only to a shallow degree, or a certain degree, you might say, through just rational belief system. But when you experience it to be true, it really does change your perspective, because it alters reality in some way,
mm,
Um, maybe to back up just a little bit. Well, okay, one other scripture verse. Christ said something like, "You can either believe me at my words, where I say that I am the truth, or at least believe the miracles, themselves."
mm-hmm,
And that was a way where he described how he confirmed truth when he lived on earth,
mm,
as we Christians believe. Um, so to back up to my story, and not to make it about me, but the interaction of our stories.
yeah.
Um, so my moment of, like, conversion of the heart came just before I began attending Cornerstone Christian School, where we went to high school, and um, so perhaps your experience of maybe my personality or character or way of describing the faith was different because, tread lightly here, but I think a lot of people at our schools experience of the faith came from that rational belief
Mm-hmm,
system that's imposed. There's certain Christian
mm-hmm,
denominations, I don't want to villainize that any, but there are certain denominations of Christianity that really impose the belief on you, whether you've had that experience yet or not. They kind
mm-hmm,
of like require you to believe it, and um, parents with good intentions will put their kids in a Christian school because they've found Christianity to be true, and so they want their kids to believe that too. But sometimes it can take away freedom, or you can exasperate your children to try to get them to believe what you believe without really giving them the freedom to experience God in their own timing, with their own freedom, in their own way, and have
mm,
their own. And so anyway, to bring it to high school, I had just had this conversion of the heart, so I was like so just ready to share my experience of who I experienced God to be, both in that moment, rescuing me from suicide. I also did a mission trip in Peru, where I felt that I saw literal miracles of, like, people being healed from illnesses, and,
mm,
like, there's this one story of, like, these, like, small roads in Peru where there's this bus, about to, like, go off a cliff because they were, like, running away from, like, banditos or whatever, and that the road, like, expanded miraculously, like, looking at it from behind or whatever. That was the story the missionary told. But anyway, I began to believe in miracles and
mm,
believe in the supernatural, and the experience of God being true, let alone the tenets of dogma and doctrine. So anyway, when I came to Cornerstone, I had just had that experience, and I think that it kind of bubbled over in who I was in a unique way at that moment in my life. That, to some degree, it was like my honeymoon period where I had just, like, met God, and I wanted to, like, share how much I loved Him to everyone in the whole world. Skipping through the flowers and fields, and it was an incredible moment of my life, which might have been the highest mountaintop that I've ever experienced, because, like, altered my reality and it became true, and I was, like, so excited. And
mm,
so I was bubbling over to those in this school that may not have had that experience yet. They had come from this maybe background of like dogma and, not that same freedom and experience and everything. And again, yeah, not to like pet my ego or my experience, but like in some ways, I feel like what contributed to some other people's conversion of the heart was that they saw an authentic conversion of the heart
Yeah.
in myself. And I can't take credit for that because it was something that happened outside of me. God
Of
did it.
course. Yeah.
I can't. I'm just sharing what happened and how I was like acting bubbly and excited and sharing what I felt I discovered to be true.
Well, and in some sense, you've continued to do that, right? Because you've been working in these youth ministries sort of ever since, more or less, right?
Yeah.
So what has that been like?
Well, yeah. So like I said, when I had this conversion of the heart, I just immediately jumped in. Okay, so this experience in Peru, I had experienced poverty for the first time. I went to a third world country and I saw just, you know, um, materialistically, just how well off I had it. And I became really grateful that I came from like an incredibly privileged position. I wanted to help others that, were malnourished and struggling and help in some way. That whole mission trip is its own story. It might be too long, but what was the question?
Well, I was curious about your trajectory into youth ministry, and then kind of where you started, and then maybe how you came into the role that you're in now. Just kind of that path, because it
Yeah,
strikes me on one hand that your experience as a teenager, like that would really give you some deep insight into working with young teenagers in the midst of what's been called the meaning crisis that
yeah,
we live in today. And
yeah, absolutely. Yeah. So, and I would say, I feel like, we talk sometimes about like giftings or like, you know, talents or God-given kind of like personality traits. And at that moment of my conversion, I kind of feel like I was given several things, like a heart for the poor, so to
mm,
speak, and also for youth, and youth in particular, because I sometimes describe to people that I was like an at-risk youth or a troubled youth or something like that. And in my like ministry to youth, I just, having had that experience, I know the struggle that can happen in teenage years or young adult years, where people can really have these um, these difficult experiences, whether it's, their hormones changing or it's, family circumstances that are changing. And teenagers, when they go through difficulty during those years, be extremely disorienting and troubling. And because you're beginning to like really write your own story, your own identity is like beginning to take shape. And for me, my identity took shape as a teenager in these experiences. And so I recognize that there's this opportunity to help, especially like troubled youth, and youth in general, to
mm,
just have an experience of faith that can be life changing, like I had.
mm,
Like I want them to like come alive to this other reality that can become like, yeah, support system and an emotional support, a spiritual support, and take their eyes off of their difficult circumstances and towards God, because it can be a real resource, is putting it lightly, but like it can just be a huge support structure for your life that's just so essential.
yeah, yeah. So where did you start?
With youth ministry,
Mm-hmm.
I started at my local church, Holy Trinity Fellowship, in Fort Collins, which was a Pentecostal church. And I just began to, yeah, I mean, probably began with more of a rational approach to just like, learning about who Jesus is, and share my story like I just did, and just talk about how it changed my life, and it can for you too, if you choose that. And not everyone accepts it, or is touched by it, which is fine. And people have different moments where they may experience that. But I do feel that in teenage years, and especially in times of difficulty, those tend to be the times where people have this experience of conversion. So I started there with my church community, but also like the friends I left behind in like public school. There was a few like friends that unfortunately had gotten like addicted to drugs, and so I like shared Jesus with them. And there's a few people that became Christians, or Christians who had this conversion of the heart, as I described it. I guess, to go on a tangent, in the Pentecostal charismatic like Christian experience, they'll often like observe that this like conversion can happen, like you described, with speaking in tongues. They call it the baptism of the Spirit. And as I've become Orthodox, I'm not positive, theologically, that that's exactly how it always happens. I don't think it always happens that way, but it can.
Sure.
It's I guess it's just like that. The baptism of the Spirit is almost like, to me, it's like that realization of like the supernatural, the miraculous, and our interaction with it. And there can be a conversion, as we've talked about, but there's a different kind of like baptism of water and baptism of the Spirit that Christ talked about himself. And that's kind of how I would put it, is like maybe baptism of the Spirit is what conversion of the heart is.
Yeah. Oh, that's an interesting idea. So what took you to Orthodoxy?
Oh, okay. And just stop me if I get too tangential, but
that's okay. We'll give it another 20 minutes or so and then wrap up.
Okay.
Does that sound okay?
Yeah, of course. So in experiencing the miraculous, the supernatural, I was Protestant from my conversion for another about 10 years. And I began to seek out the miraculous. And I would try to like gain skill in like, how to pray for the sick and see them be healed. How to share my faith and see people have this conversion of the heart. Whatever it is, I saw some crazy stuff. I saw someone get out of a wheelchair after a friend prayed for them. I again, in Peru, I saw someone who had a fever one day, like high fever, like on, I wouldn't say deathbed, but like seriously ill, and prayed for him myself. And next day he was completely better. So just, I guess, this experience of the miraculous was another good beginning point. But I began to find that in the Pentecostal charismatic kind of world, there was a bit of weirdness, I guess, that came along with it, where somehow I had this experience of like people getting a little bit unstable with their pursuit of like the miraculous or supernatural. Where like there are also what you might say like dark experiences of the supernatural, demonic. I've also seen people rolling on the ground, foaming at the mouth. That sounds crazy to just the modern ears. Like, don't believe me if you don't want to, but I saw it with my eyes. I can't, like, maybe you haven't seen it, but I did. And so anyway, roundabout way of answering how I became Orthodox. It's kind of interesting. I said that I had kind of this conversion of the heart first, but later I began to see kind of some of this instability in my experience of the Protestant world, where each local church, each local pastor kind of had their own take on what Scripture says is true. There's like something like 10,000 different denominations out there, Christian denominations, and each denomination has a different set of truth, Christian truth. And I just began to think, like, how can it all be true? Like, is it really relative? Like, is there not a truth out there? And so I began to study and listen to podcasts, and actually a priest in Loveland, Father Evan Armadas, at Saint Spiridon's Orthodox Church. I listened to his podcast for about 6 years
Mm.
before I was ready to believe that Orthodoxy was the truth. Like,
Mm.
and I say truth, like I feel objectively like it's the truth. And that's, I came to that through a number of different experiences, and also like rational study of history, of my experience in the supernatural, Christian truth and culture, and scripture, and all these proofs that just checked the box for me. And
Mm.
it was at another, difficult moment in my life where I experienced a church split.
Mm.
Uh, you know, Maybe we can have a chapter 2 sometime. But I at one point moved from our affluent Fort Collins, Colorado upbringing to the inner city, Kansas City, and I started to do missions there. And I went with a group of people from my home church, and started a Protestant church there. And in the end, it split. There was a lot of yuckiness that happened, a lot of conflict over
Mm.
leadership and theology.
Mm.
And that's where I began to think, like, well, not every version of this can be true. Like, it can't be person to person.
Yeah.
So I started to seek it out on my own, like, okay, what confirms truth? And I found it in Orthodoxy through this podcast, and I can go in more depth at some point. But yeah, I mean, it was more the rational side of things through
Yeah.
study.
And then, so was there a significant amount of time between when you kind of stopped attending a Protestant church before you started attending an Orthodox, or did you kind of just go straight across?
No, I kind of, when the church split in Kansas City, I kind of jumped ship pretty quick. I pretty much immediately started going to the Orthodox Church because I had already begun listening to like podcasts on Orthodoxy for at least 4 years at that point. And had probably come to the point where I felt like it was true, but I was still going to a Protestant church. And and what was interesting is that it wasn't just the truth part of it, but there was a community in Kansas City that was incredible. And they were beginning to, well, not beginning, but they were doing some really great stuff in Kansas City, where they were serving the poor. And they basically, short story is, they set up shop on this in this 90% African American neighborhood that was impoverished. But it was, they parked their, they bought their church on this historical segregation line, where there was legally a separation from blacks and whites on one side, black side, whites on another. And the whites were affluent, and the blacks were poor, because politically and socially, that's what was imposed on them. And they basically just began to try to like heal that that divide.
Mm.
They had a social agency called Reconciliation Services,
Mm.
and they did simple stuff like, this classic soup kitchen, to like helping people get their ID cards and documents in order, to like life skill classes, for the elderly, like technology classes, or for men in particular. They had this man class where they learned to like just basic life skills of like, yeah, how to have an interview, how to cook for yourself, why it's important to like take care of your family, and just like pretty like sometimes assumed
Mm-hmm.
beliefs that, for people that come from broken situations, might need some education and support. And anyway, so my discovery of Orthodoxy came hand in hand with the rational, and also of this community that was incredible. They were doing really great things with the poor, so to speak, and they were confirming the belief that I began to find to be true.
Mm.
And So again, there's more to the story as far as like youth ministry and to kind of this beginning of like service to the poor. But that's the short version of the story.
Yeah. Well, maybe, and thank you for sharing all this. This has been really fun.
Yeah.
Um, do you have anything that you'd sort of like to wrap it up with?
I don't know if I have too much else to say exactly. I guess the last just little small tidbit is just I know in this age of like authenticity and like the option of having all these different experiences and beliefs out there. I know I've described Christianity and Orthodox Christianity as like the truth, and that can really like rub people the wrong way when you first hear it. But um, I guess what I'm trying to say is that like I've come to like believe it as true. I don't impose it on other people, but there's reasons why I say that, through my
Mm-hmm.
experience, through my study, um, and Orthodoxy. I found in the Christian world to be a very mature,
Mm.
balanced, historical, culturally rich tradition. And having had just this really wide spectrum of experiences from like my mom, who's Buddhist basically, to Catholic, to Protestant, to Orthodoxy. I had times in my life where I had trouble believing that God was real. Like with this big buffet sample platter of like experiences I've had, I do really believe that like it is objective truth, but that's something that can be, you know, discussed and maybe argued on either side at a different point too. But I guess I just kind of wanted to like put that bookmark there too, because like, yeah, I describe that as truth, and it doesn't mean that, and I kind of describe it as like fullness. It's like what I've found to be spiritually full for me.
Mm.
And so if you're not at that place, don't be offended. Um, I just posing that as what I've found, and everyone's at their own point of journey with that claim. So don't feel threatened by it.
Well, it seems like, to know the truth is demonstrated in your life. It's not something that is to be had, but it's something to be in relation to.
Mm-hmm.
And yeah. Well, thank you, David.
Yeah,
Thanks
of
for
course.
thanks for chatting.
Thanks for having me on.